All righty, well, let's get started here. Welcome, everybody. My name's Galen Barbos. I'm joined here by my colleague, Will Gorman, and we're excited to have you all here today and to share with you some of the findings from a report that we released last week that is focused on evaluating the evolving role of behind-the-meter solar and storage in household backup power applications. And this study was something of a follow-up to a report that we put out last year. That report last year was also focused on backup power applications, but really within the context of the existing building stock. And so this more recent report, it really kind of picks up on some of the themes and the findings from that earlier study, but instead really focused on how the potential and the role of solar plus storage in backup power applications will evolve as buildings become progressively more efficient, more flexible, and more electrified. And so that's really the kind of the framing and the focus of the work that we'll be sharing with you all today. Before I get started, I want to just go over kind of some of the standard housekeeping items. So first is that this webinar is being recorded, and we will post a recording of the webinar online. The webinar slides are essentially just a subset or excerpt of the larger report. So the report is a PowerPoint document, and the slides that we'll be sharing are based on those from the report. But the report, of course, is much more expansive and covers much more material than what we'll get through here. So I think it's probably best served by just referring to the slides from the report itself. Also wanted to mention that we hope to have about 15-20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So I would encourage all of you to ask questions as we go. You'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, so please type your questions in there, and we will try to get through as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar. So with that, let's begin. And Will, if you could advance to slide number 3, or actually slide number 4, I'm sorry. Context and motivation, I think I kind of gave you some of the background in terms of the prior work that this study is building on. And really the only thing I wanted to mention here is just that backup power really is one of, if not the primary driver, at least currently, for the adoption of residential storage and solar systems. This has been, one of the main dynamics that we've seen, and I think most signs point towards an even greater importance of backup power demand into backup power applications going forward. And so this is an important use case to understand, and is one that has been somewhat understudied. And so really the motivation of our work in this space is to just bring some additional analysis and information to help guide the market and help customers and installers and vendors and policymakers and everybody understand kind of what the capabilities and limits are of these systems in this particular application. Next slide, please, Will. So I talked already about the objective of the study. The approach that we've taken, this is a modeling-based study, and will talk in more detail about the specifics of kind of the modeling approach that we've taken. The other thing I just wanted to emphasize here, though, is that this analysis really is kind of focused on the technical capabilities of these systems. It's not an economic analysis. We're not looking at the cost of these systems or the value of the avoided power interruptions. This is really just kind of focused on kind of technical considerations. Some of the work that we'll be doing over the next year will begin to venture more into some of the economic trade-offs, but that's not the focus of the study today. The key elements of the study scope, these are also items that we'll talk more in depth about shortly. But I do just want to mention that the focus of this analysis here is on single-family residential buildings. The report that we put out last year looked at a broader range of different building types, both residential and commercial. But our focus here today is really just on residential buildings and on long duration power interruptions lasting at least a day or more. Some of the other work that we've done and are continuing to do has involved looking at these systems and how they respond to kind of short duration but unpredictable power interruptions. But that's not the focus here today. Here we're focusing on long duration power interruptions, really with kind of the presumption that in most of these cases, customers have some ability to anticipate these events. And so with that, I'm going to hand things over to Will, who will share all the details about what we did.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Galen, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us to hear a little bit about what we have been working on when it comes to backup power and solar and storage at the lab over the last year. So I have the floor for about 30 minutes, where I will talk in a little bit more detail than what Galen just mentioned about the data and the methods that we're bringing to bear to answer some of our key research questions. And then I will go through the results of our analysis. So I know there's a lot of words on this slide, and so bear with me, but it's pretty important. I might spend the longest time here just so we all are on the same page in terms of our framework here. So the first important point is that we are focused on 10 locations across the country, which I'll share on the next slide. But for those of you who are maybe familiar with our work in this area and saw our year one report, this is a little bit of a difference. Whereas last year, we looked at every county within the continental United States, given our desire to generate lots and lots of building models with lots and lots of different load measures. We narrowed that down to 10 locations. We are generating baseline load profiles, as Galen mentioned, for single-family residential homes using the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's ResStock model, where we are receiving a statistically representative distribution of 1,000 building models per location that we specify, and these are done at a 15-minute interval. So those baseline load profiles are based on the baseline building stock within those regions. And then the key focus of our study, as Galen was talking about, is to understand how combinations of building efficiency and load flexibility and electrification will impact the resulting load profiles of those building stocks, and then how that impact will then go towards impacting the system size you might need to back up that home in the event of a power interruption. So in addition to these load profiles and the corresponding assumptions related to them, there are a number of other assumptions about how we actually think about a power interruption event for a household. And so that's what I have listed down here. The first critical point to highlight is that for all of the results, for the majority of the results that I'm going to share today, heating and cooling loads are included within the critical load for backup power. And so it's really important to kind of know that as we step through some of the results, they're really going to be driven by a lot of those heating and cooling load differences. In terms of power interruption assumptions, the baseline case that I'll be showing is for a 3-day event that starts at midnight. And then maybe most critically, one of the most important assumptions that we make, and therefore I will talk about a sensitivity to this assumption, is, well, what day within the year is this power outage going to actually happen at your home? And what we do is we take the 90th percentile net load day. And I'll unpack what I mean by that. First thing is that we can calculate the net load for each day across all of our building models, taking the load of the building for that day, subtracting out the solar production that we simulate. And so that results in 365 net load observations. So when I say that 90th percentile net load day, we're basically choosing the 36th highest net load day, given that there's 365 days in the year. And so I think the way that we like to kind of boil that all down is that these are challenging conditions, but they are not the most extreme condition that a household might experience in terms of their building demand over the course of the day. But again, we're going to show a sensitivity to that assumption so you can get a little bit of intuition about how that impacts our results. Quick two last points here is that we are sizing our solar systems at 100% of the annual consumption of the building, which is what we see for the most part as a key heuristic being used to size solar systems across the United States. But we do this up to 70% of the roof area. And so we have a slight constraint on that if that constraint is binding. And then finally, the analysis, everything that I'm going to show you here is the minimum storage size we calculate is needed to provide backup power, given those set of critical load assumptions that I just mentioned. And we importantly do not employ any consideration of cost. As Galen mentioned, there's no economics here or space constraints, meaning like, can you actually fit those batteries in your garage, for instance? The only space constraints we consider explicitly are on the solar system. Okay, so I mentioned we focused on 10 locations. You can now see those explicitly written here. And the goal with this selection was to span a fairly diverse range of climates, as well as solar insolation levels. And so we think we do that. We have lots of different longitudes and latitudes covered here. But in addition to weather, one of the key findings from our first year's report, where we were studying these systems, is that there is also a lot of regional difference in the building stock conditions. And when we selected these particular cities, we wanted to be particularly attuned to capturing that regional distribution of building stock conditions. And so that will be important as we walk through the results. Okay, so a little bit more detail on the load simulations we considered. For load flexibility, when I say that in the context of this report, what I'm meaning is that we have different temperature set point adjustments that we make on the building stock. And what we do is we change the cooling set points by 5 degrees Fahrenheit, so they go up by 5 degrees, and we decrease heating set points by 6 degrees. And these were informed by typical setbacks that we see amongst a smaller distribution of homes within the baseline stock. To enhance the efficiency of the home, the envelope efficiency, we take both insulation and air sealing measures corresponding with something the National Renewable Energy Laboratory does, who are key partners here. And if you're interested in the specifics of those measures, there is a report that we link to here, as well as in our report, where they explain some of those details. But you should just think about this as envelope efficiency improvements. We study a lot of heat pump scenarios. So a lot of heat pump retrofits. This is a key electrification trend and effort that is happening across the country. And so we wanted to include a lot of variability here. So we have different heat pump efficiency levels. We have different heat pump sizing conventions. So whether it's sized to meet the max cooling load of your home or the max load overall, which can have a very big difference, especially if you are relying on fossil-based heating before undergoing this heat pump retrofit. And then we also vary the backup heating type. So in some cases, those heat pumps maybe cannot meet the full heating demand, especially if it's sized to the max cooling load. And so we have this backup heating type difference between either electric resistance heating or relying on the existing fossil heat of the home. Other electrification measures that we include are heat pump water heaters, heat pump dryers, induction ranges, electric ovens. So you'll see a scenario related to that. And then when I turn things back over to Galen, he'll talk a little bit about how we thought about electric vehicles for the purpose of our report. But for you all, as I walk through the results, the key thing to keep in mind is that electric vehicles are not a load anywhere in what I'm talking about. So keep that in mind, and we'll come back to it. So overall, given this, we had 17 different load scenarios, 170,000 different unique building models in 10 locations. And that's kind of how you get from 17 load scenarios, 1,000 homes per location to all of those load profiles. And so that is one of the reasons why we scaled things down to just focus on 10 locations. I'm going to spend really no time here, and I'm definitely not going to walk through the Greek on the slide. It's mostly just so that I can at least convince you that we did develop an optimization model, pretty simple one, linear optimization, that we are using to solve for that minimum storage size. We have some constraints on the power capacity of these batteries, where we basically assume that at a minimum, it's a 1-hour duration battery. So we don't let the kilowatt charge or discharge rate exceed the kilowatt hour rating. And in all these scenarios, we assume that the battery starts with 100% state of charge at the beginning of the interruption, and then some assorted storage assumptions are down below. But I think that is all the time I want to spend on dispatch and sizing. And in fact, that is all the time I'm going to spend on data and methods. So encourage you, one, as Galen mentioned, to look at the report if you're interested in diving any deeper into any of the assumptions of our approach that you can find in the results. Or alternatively, we will have 15 minutes at the end of the session. If anything I breezed over is confusing, please put that in the Q&A function, and I'll be sure to try to address it. But let's get into the results, because this is more interesting. I'm going to break up the results conversation into 3 sections. I'm first going to start with just results for the baseline building stock, and this is just to build some intuition about how things vary across our locations, some of the key metric, or the key metric that we're going to use to express the results, so that we just kind of understand and are on the same page of what comes out of our analysis. And then I'm going to go into the specific DER measures, which is really the centerpiece of our analysis, all those load measures I talked about. And then I'll have a short section on sensitivity cases that study how those different interruption assumptions, some of the ones we think are most important, how those affect our results. And again, I know we're saying this multiple times, but it's not worth, or it is worth reinstating that we have almost 60, maybe even more slides in our report online. We do not have time to go through that many slides in this presentation. So there are a lot of additional results not covered by me today verbally that are still interesting. So definitely encourage you to explore those online. I think Galen put a link in the chat to those. All right, so let's talk about some of the results. The first thing to point out is that the primary metric for our analysis that I'm going to show you throughout all the slides today is the median required battery size across all of the modeled buildings in each location. I did mention we simulate 1,000 building models for all of these scenarios. In the report, we do have distributions, so you can look at that. But here, I'm mostly going to focus on medians. Again, our assumption on critical loads is that they include heating and cooling demand. I will show a little bit later a sensitivity where we drop that assumption and we're focused just on things like refrigeration and lighting, and some amount of plug loads like internet and then water heating. So we have this limited critical load scenario that I'll show, but for the majority of the slides, they all include heating and cooling. The power interruption is 3 days, starting at midnight. And again, we start at this 90th percentile net load day. That's very critical. There's these challenging but not extreme conditions. Okay, so that all in mind, you can look at this graph, or you probably already have been looking at this graph on the right, where you see all of the cities and counties that we focus on the x-axis and the median battery size required. And you can see that there is a decent amount of variability, with battery sizes ranging anywhere from 10 kilowatt hours in Los Angeles, a relatively temperate place, all the way up to 90 kilowatt hours in DFW, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Phoenix. The other thing you will note on this slide is these circled dots, and this is to build some intuition about one of the key drivers of some of our results, which is the presence of fossil-based heating systems. And you can see that the difference between those bars and dots is different depending on the location. And this relates to the fact that some locations, electric resistance heating is more common. And in some places, that season, the winter season, is what is driving the battery size required. And so with looking at a subset of homes that are fossil heated in those regions, that battery size decreases. So you see that with Memphis, DFW, DC. You importantly don't see that with some of the coldest regions that we study on the left side, and that's because the majority of homes in those regions are fossil heated. And so the all home result is pretty similar to the fossil heated homes, given that most homes are fossil heated. So thinking about some of those impacts is going to be important as we walk through some of the results. This slide is meant to build some general intuition that will be driving really all of our results. And it's the fact that we find a linear trend between the battery size required, which is on the y-axis, and the net load demanded by a customer over the interruption event, which is the x-axis. So this might be pretty straightforward or somewhat obvious that if you're going to consume more during your event, you're going to need a bigger battery. And that is definitely what we find. But I think the reason we like to show this graph is because a lot of those load measures that we're adjusting, that we'll start to go through on the next few slides, in effect, those are really operating through the mechanism of changing the net load during an interruption event. And so that's just kind of an important thread to follow as we walk through these results. Now, that all being said, there's a pretty high R squared on this relationship, but if you look at this insert that we blow up here, is that there is variability, and it's not a perfect match. There's a lot of homes that are off to the side, and this really relates to the fact that these deviations could be caused by load shapes and timings of demand, which might ultimately impact battery sizing. It relates a little bit to solar curtailment and the fact that not all solar, especially in an island operating mode with a home, will be able to be captured by the battery at all times. And there's also a little bit of battery power constraints binding here. So all of those things can have an impact on the size. So it's just important to build a little bit of that intuition. All right, so let's now go to the main event here, where we're going to talk about these different DER measures that we considered. Importantly, as we walk through these results, the way that we show them is that they are added sequentially to each other. And so what that means is we first start and we add these set point temperature adjustments on top of that baseline building stock and show you how the battery sizing changes. And then we incrementally add the building envelope efficiency upgrades. So you have the set point adjustments plus the building envelope adjustments, and we see how much incremental change we get in the battery. And you do that with the heat pump retrofit and the other electrification measures. And so you might be wondering, well, doesn't the order of operations of that framework matter? And you're absolutely right, it definitely does. In the main results, something I probably annoyingly keep harping on, we do change the order of operations and show how those incremental impacts are affected. I'll mention a little bit of that verbally, but to really see a different order of some of these things, you'll have to go into the results section or the report online. Okay, so let's look at the impact of the temperature set point. So similar chart that we just saw, and the gray bars, that's what you just saw, that's the baseline case. And then you can see that when you employ those set point temperature adjustments that I mentioned earlier, how that minimum battery size changes. And what we see is we have the largest reductions in 5 locations with particularly hot summers, or a concentration of electric resistance heating. So that is Washington, D.C., Memphis, Dallas, Fort Worth, Phoenix, Tampa. We see that reductions are a little bit smaller for the subset of homes that are fossil heated in those regions, but they are still sizable. And so this might relate to the fact that a lot of the system sizing decision here is driven by the summer season in those cases rather than the winter season. And so you still see, pretty substantial reductions in battery system size. What is also interesting on this slide is that in the other locations that I didn't mention, you see fairly negligible results, and that's due mostly to mild summers. So summers not necessarily driving these outage or power interruption net load conditions, and predominantly fossil-based heating. Okay, so that was the temperature set point adjustment. Now you see here in blue that I'm actually adding the temperature set point and the building envelope together without incrementally showing you that impact. And that's basically because the direction of the result, as well as the magnitude of the result for the building envelope efficiency, is basically the same story as I just mentioned with the set point adjustment. So similar regional breakdown, and similar quantitative results. So now we're going to skip ahead to, well, what's the incremental impact of once you have that set point adjustment, once you've added the building envelope efficiency, what happens when you add a highly efficient heat pump that is sized to maximum load, but with fossil backup heat? And what we see here is a little more interesting in that the directionality of the impact changes by location. So in relatively hot places, which is Memphis, Dallas, Fort Worth, Phoenix, Tampa, you see heat pump retrofits reducing the battery size needed for riding through that power interruption, which is mainly driven by the mechanism of replacing an inefficient air conditioner in those locations with a more efficient heat pump. Whereas in cold locations, heat pump retrofits are generally requiring larger batteries. And again, this is mainly due to some of the thread that you might start to be picking up on, that those locations were predominantly fossil heated homes. And so when you add that heat pump retrofit, you're now electrifying a pretty substantial load. And that is going to require, if you're trying to provide backup power during those conditions, a larger battery. And so that is what we see here in this result. Now, it's important to make the point that this isn't all kind of doom and gloom, for heat pumps by any means. And I think the best way to show that is to look at, well, what happens when you add a heat pump, when you're focused on a subset of homes from the baseline conditions that were relying on electric resistance heating. And so that's what we're doing here. In the blue bars, these are electric resistance heated homes. And the yellow bars are what happens when those electric resistance heated homes install a heat pump retrofit. And you can see here that this decreases the battery size pretty substantially in cold weather places, which you might imagine. Duluth is a little bit of an extreme case, of course. It's particularly cold. But you still see really substantial battery reductions in a lot of places, or a lot of the locations that we focus on here. Now, of course, it is a little bit uncommon for homes in some of these locations, particularly these cold locations, for homes to have these electric resistance heating technologies, in part because it requires so much electricity to provide the heating demand. But they are not unheard of. So you still do see them. And so, if these types of homes were interested in backup power, we would really see the installation of a heat pump being probably the first key step that they would need to take if they want to maintain this type of heating demand. All right, but now let's put it all together. I'm not going to explicitly focus on the electrification of other end uses because we're just going to look at it on this graph. And so what this graph is now showing you are those 10 locations and the incremental change in required battery sizing as you move through these different measure bundles. And so the results in yellow you have already seen, but now I'm explicitly showing you these building envelope efficiency so that you can see that, like, directionally and quantitatively, those results are pretty similar to the set point adjustments, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. You can see some of those directionality differences across different locations, where in those yellow bars, you see them kind of going up pretty dramatically in some of the cold weather places, whereas they go down pretty dramatically lower in some of the hot weather places. And then I think, one interesting thing to explicitly call out here is Los Angeles, which is a relatively temperate place, is that really with all of these different measure bundles that we add on, they really have marginal or negligible impacts on the ultimate size of the battery that you see. The other thing that we like to point out on this slide is that the electrification of these other end uses, which again are water heating and cooking, those are the two key things that we're adding here, those have both fairly negligible impacts on the size of the battery. And you might be a little confused as to, sometimes it actually goes down, and that actually relates to the fact that with heat pump water heating, or at least in part relates to the fact that with heat pump water heating, you might actually facilitate the cooling of your home as the heat pump is sucking heat out of the home to heat up the water, and that reduces strain on your air conditioning system. And so, again, those effects are all fairly negligible, but just if you're a little curious about why the direction of those effects can be different. Okay, so one of the things that we looked at, since we do have access to a distribution of 1,000 homes in each of these locations, is how should we think about the addressable market for solar and storage? And the way we think about this is today, 30 kilowatt hours of battery is really at the upper end of the size range that we observe being adopted. And this is about a little bit more than 2 Tesla Powerwalls. And so what we do is we can look at, okay, let's assume that the home had 30 kilowatt hours of storage system. What is the percent of homes within a given location that could actually meet that power interruption case that we specify, which again, 3 days, 90th percentile net load day. And so that's what you see on this graph here for different building stocks. So baseline in gray, set point and envelope efficiency in blue, and then that heat pump retrofit in yellow. And so in the baseline building stock, what we see is that a 30 kilowatt hour system could provide backup for some portion of the existing building stock, ranging from 6% in Phoenix all the way to 90% in LA, again, that temperate place. But through a combination of some of these different measures, we see that every location could achieve at least 60% of homes being able to provide backup within their particular situation with a 30 kilowatt hour storage system. Now, that the measure is not always consistent for each location. So for instance, in cold weather places, it's addressable with the baseline building stock and with set point adjustment and envelope efficiencies. Of course, when you add heat pumps to those cases, that percentage drops down, which is consistent with what we've been talking about prior. Whereas it's the reverse in some of these hot weather places, whereas adding all of the measures increases the addressable market more and more. All right, so with the last 5 or so minutes of my time, I'm now going to talk about these sensitivity analyses, which all have incremental impacts on everything that I've been talking about. And importantly, these are sensitivity analyses related to the power interruption conditions. So both the duration of the condition, the timing of that interruption, as well as the decision for what loads a homeowner may or may not want to back up. Again, we have a lot more sensitivities in the report. If you're curious about some of the other assumptions and the impacts of those on our findings, definitely download that report. Okay, but let's first consider the interruption event duration. And so on this slide, what I'm showing is a similar slide that we just looked at, and the fact that we're focused on 30 kilowatt hour batteries systems, but then instead of solving for the minimum size, we're saying like, okay, if you have a 30 kilowatt hour system, what is the median number of days over which that solar and storage system could actually provide backup power, given changes to these load measures that we've been talking about. And the intuition here is like larger events typically will require larger batteries, as the daily solar generation will not typically be enough to fully replenish the battery. And so that initial state of charge will get drawn down over the course of the event. And so what you see here is going from the baseline case to the set point adjustment and efficiency case. That always increases the amount of time that battery will last, because you're in effect reducing net load. And so you can see in many locations that for that event, you could actually get 7 days or longer of backup power with that size battery. You see that in Denver and Boston. You see that when you go to the all measures case, which includes those heat pump retrofits, that the number of days that system would last does go down, consistent with prior results in Duluth, Denver, and Boston, but it goes up pretty substantially in some of these hot weather locations. And then LA, as we've been talking about, a fairly temperate place. Regardless of the DER measure, we see that particular battery size, given that climate, could really last for a week or longer in the median building that we study. All right, so now let's look at this interruption start day, which in my mind is honestly one of the most important sensitivities to focus on and think about, in part because this is a key decision and discussion that I would assume that all system installers and customers are thinking about when thinking about what size of battery should I purchase to provide backup power. And that's like, well, what is the weather? What is my load going to be, or would it have been when I lost power? And so for all of the results that we've been talking about so far, we're focused on this 90% case, which is this really light yellow bar. And so you could ask the question like, well, what if you go to an extreme condition? You know, you're looking at the third worst day of the year. So it's 99th percentile. And you can see in the baseline building stock condition, you know, that can sometimes double the battery size that you would need if you are going to try to fulfill that demand on that particular day. And so this could be in DC, if this is a winter event, that could be just because it's a really cold time. And so you have a really big heating load. And that requires larger battery if you're going to try to meet that load. You can see, though, that this does change based on which load measure you're considering, whether you're thinking about the baseline building stock, where you see particularly high numbers in Phoenix and DFW. And then you go to the all measure case, where we've seen that those heat pumps and all of the different measures really reduce the battery size. And you see that result on this slide as well. Now, of course, you know, you could also imagine that a customer might think that I'm going to employ some more dramatic load flexibility measures, and I don't need to demand all of the heating and cooling that I might experience on an extreme day. that's obviously a customer decision, but you could kind of think about this interruption start day metric as a proxy for some of those net load reductions. And you can see that if you're not sizing to that 90th percentile day, you could get a much smaller battery if you're looking, for instance, at that 70th percentile day. And then obviously, if you're sizing it only based on the best day, so where there's the most solar production and the least amount of load, you're going to need a much smaller battery, but you're going to be at greater risk, given that that's probably a smaller probability event happening to you. My last sensitivity here is just this alternative backup load scenario. Won't spend a lot of time here, but we mentioned that all of our results have been focused on heating and cooling load. And now we ask the question, well, what would happen if we exclude heating and cooling? And that's this limited critical load scenario, where we're just backing up, refrigerators, lighting, water heating, and some plug loads like internet. And you can see that for those cases, battery sizes were quite small, all less than 15 kilowatt hours across all locations, and they are largely unaffected by the set of DER measures. So you can see that in these circles. The triangles on this slide, on the other hand, show, well, what if you want to back up the entire home's load? So these are things like electric dryers, dishwashers, a lot of plug loads that we don't consider critical. And we saw that requires basically 30 kilowatt hours of additional storage on average. And it, again, didn't matter that much based on different DER measures, meaning it was always basically a 30 kilowatt hour battery size increase on average. All right, so with that, I am turning it back over to Galen to bring us home, and then we will shortly get into the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Will. So I'll be quick here. Before getting to the conclusions, though, I wanted to take us on a brief detour to discuss the sidebar here related to electric vehicles. And so as Will mentioned in discussing the kind of the setup for this study, we didn't include EVs as a load. They're obviously a large additional load that can be added to a building. And we didn't really think about what that would mean in terms of the size of the stationary battery that you might need if your intent was to also provide backup power to an EV. The more important point that I wanted to really highlight here, though, is that aside from being a possible additional load, EVs are, of course, a potentially additional source and a potentially large additional source of energy storage. In other words, if you've got an EV with bidirectional charging capability, that is potentially a 50 to 100 kilowatt hour battery sitting in your garage. That's what the figure here with the red dots is intended to show, just kind of give a sense of the typical range of battery storage sizes in common EV models on the market today. And so some of the results that Will shared, you saw that there were cases where a relatively large battery might be needed. Those are, for example, in very cold weather regions like Duluth, if you've got electric space heating. It could be if you're planning for really extreme weather conditions, those 99th percentile conditions that we saw a couple slides ago. It could just be if your home is not at the median for your region. Maybe you have a very large home or just have particularly large usage that can't be mitigated through any of the measures that we added here. All of those are examples where you might need 50 to 100 kilowatt hours of battery storage to power through a 3-day outage, or potentially a longer outage. And EVs are potentially a really important enabling technology for those kinds of situations. And so this is certainly an area that I think we're interested in exploring further. Next slide. So just to kind of wrap things up with some kind of high-level summary points, just in terms of the high level, important to understand, there's a really wide diversity in the existing building stock, and a wide distribution in how large of a battery you might need to provide backup for any given home in any given location. The report really kind of, reveals and explores that more than we were able to in the webinar here today. In terms of the specific DER measures, we saw that both load flexibility measures and building envelope efficiency upgrades can reduce required storage sizing, particularly in regions with large, or for homes with large heating and cooling loads. And that might be, in hot weather regions with lots of AC loads, or in cold weather regions where you've got electric space heating. And so for those sorts of situations, load flexibility and efficiency can be really powerful measures to couple with a solar+storage system if you're thinking about backup power needs and kind of minimizing the aggregate cost of that system. Heat pumps are complicated, and I think our analysis it sort of fails to reduce down to a simple kind of a simple soundbite in terms of the takeaway. I think what we saw is that first, it really depends on what region you're looking at. In hot climates, replacing your existing heating and cooling systems with an efficient heat pump can significantly reduce the amount of battery storage that you need for backup power. In cold climates, it depends on what your baseline heating fuel is. If you're replacing electric resistance heat with an efficient heat pump, that's going to be hugely beneficial in terms of reducing the battery storage size that you need. But if, as is more commonly the case, you're replacing fossil heating, that's going to, of course, increase the amount of battery storage that you need, though that can be mitigated to some degree through efficiency and load flexibility, as we discussed. We didn't really talk about the heat pump configuration. Here within the report, we provide some sensitivities looking at how big of a battery you would need based on the sizing of the heat pump, based on the efficiency of the heat pump, and importantly, based on what kind of backup heating technology you have with the heat pump. Many heat pumps have an electric resistance heating as a backup heat. In other cases, you might retain your legacy fossil heating system to use to provide either supplemental heat if your heat pump isn't able to fully meet your heating loads, or during particularly extreme cases or during power outages, you might lean more heavily on that legacy fossil heating system. So those things make a really big difference in terms of the implications of heat pumps for backup battery storage sizing. Will also showed some results looking at other types of electrification measures, cooking and water heating in particular. And I think the main takeaway there is that those other types of electrification measures don't ultimately move the needle very much in terms of how big of a battery you would need for backup power, mostly just because those other loads aren't especially large loads on an energy basis, and so they don't impact battery sizing that significantly. And then the last slide here, we've just identified, Will, if you want to advance, on our final slide, whenever we go through these projects, we always end with a long list of things that we would love to dig more further into in the future. And so we've identified some of those here. I won't run through all of these. Certainly, we welcome any suggestions that you all may have on areas that would be interesting or worthwhile to dig into further. And so with that, let's turn to the Q&A. We've got 6 questions here, so we'll just run through them in order, and hopefully we can get through them all. So question number 1, how do you estimate the available roof area? Is it data directly from ResStock? And I can probably just answer this by saying, yes, it is. ResStock has a field for roof area, and that's what we use. Next question, and Will, I'm going to look to you for some of these. So the next question, were any home loads cooling dominant, or were all homes heat load dominant? And Will, you can answer that verbally. I think we do have a slide somewhere buried in the appendix here that might be handy, but finding it is another matter. While Will, there we go, he's there.
Yeah, so we do look at this. So you can see it quantitatively here, but I mean the short answer is that there's a little bit of both. There's some homes that are cooling dominant, and there's some homes that are heat dominant, and sometimes this changes, or it can change, depending on the measure scenario that we're running. And so what we show on this slide is, we talked a lot about this 90th percentile framework. So based on that, you can see the season that that day happens in, and that will drive whether it's cooling or heating dominant. So you see Phoenix, it's mostly all summer, so it's cooling dominant. You can see Memphis having switched from maybe half cooling and half heating to just all heating dominant as things are electrified. So hopefully that gives you some of that context about that question.
Great. Thanks, Will. We've got another question. This is a great question, and Will, is also one for you that there is an appendix slide that may be helpful. Was capacity a limitation here? I think it's specifically the inverter capacity a limitation in areas with smaller energy storage requirements?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it shows that you have some intuition about how this would play out. And so maybe this slide will give you a little bit of what that result entails. And I would probably point you most, given your question, to LA. So what I show here is the total energy that we've been talking about throughout this whole presentation in kilowatt hours, divided by either the max charging or discharging that we show in our simulation. And this then implies a given duration, which indirectly kind of relates to this constraint, where you would think that if it's a low number, that you're butting up against a capacity constraint, where if it's a really high number, basically you have a huge battery size system, and that you wouldn't think, if you have such a big kilowatt hour investment, you're probably not worried about the power investment. And what you see here is that LA, which has been our lowest battery size result, there is a lot smaller ratios, and that's because there's smaller batteries here. And so you do get closer to that constraint, which we put it at 1. We said that you don't want the power larger than the kilowatt hour size, but you're still seeing predominantly 2 to 4 to 4 hour duration batteries. But this, you do see this kind of relationship in the result.
One thing I'm not sure, maybe you mentioned this, Will, and I missed it, but our analysis relies on 15-minute interval load data. And so that's the kind of the granularity that we're operating at. And so those are the intervals over which we are kind of measuring the max kW charge and discharge. Next question, is frequency of interruption considered? I understand this is based on a 3-day period, but thinking about New England, where we experience a lot of grid interruptions, we could rely more on the battery. And I can take a first crack at answering this, though actually, Will, I see that you've signaled that you would like to answer it, so I'll just let you do it.
I was mostly just saying that I was just doing the task, but I will answer it. And the answer is, in this work we did not. We have, as Galen mentioned, I think earlier on in this presentation, a subset of work that's looking at more short duration outages that are modeled stochastically, that they could be multiple, they could happen, one after the other, and we study kind of how that relates to not necessarily the battery size, but the percentage of load that can be met. So I guess the first thing I would say is point you to that work. And maybe the key maybe intuition to build is that it is very different to think about a short duration but stochastic interruption event, in which predicting the beginning state of charge of your battery becomes critical, versus a long duration event, which might be driven by extreme weather, which hopefully, or we assume, could be predicted, and you have a larger state of charge covered by the battery. So there's a lot of differences, I think, related to your question in terms of how you might model and simulate the battery's capability, and that's kind of why we we have them in two different reports in some sense, in two different studies rather than within one.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that, Will, is just that if you're thinking about a scenario where there are multiple long duration outages, then the relevant question is kind of what's the worst of those in terms of the duration and in the construct that we use, the net load during that event. And so if the battery is sized to meet that sort of the worst of those multiple long duration events, then it should be sufficient for the less extreme events. So I think if you're thinking about that sort of situation, then I think the relevant question is like what is the worst of those multiple long duration events that you want to plan for. Next question here, and more keep trickling in, so I apologize. I can tell we're not going to get through them all, but we'll hopefully be able to get through at least one or two more. Next question, how does NEM reform, net energy metering reform, play out relative to PV and storage sizing? For example, California moving to NEM 3.0, would that lead to additional sizing beyond just backup, or would that already be included as a subset of this 3-day duration? So I think, I mean, we as Will mentioned, are just sort of stipulating the PV system size. So that's not optimized in our analysis. We were just sort of specifying essentially the largest rooftop system that a customer could install, subject to meeting up to 100% of their annual energy load. It's, I suppose, conceivable that under NEM 3.0, I mean, I think, and this goes beyond what we looked at in this study. So this is just sort of extemporaneously talking here, but under NEM 3.0, where you're reducing the export compensation, generally that will tend to lead customers to install smaller PV systems. And so that would then change the results of our analysis. If we were to assume, I mean, the PV systems that we're assuming here are, I would say, kind of the largest that you would typically see a customer install, and that is generally going to happen under a kind of a full retail rate NEM situation. So that's not something we looked at here. Within our year one study, the study that we published last year, we did run some sensitivities with other PV system sizing assumptions, and so I guess my best suggestion would be to point towards that study. But I think it's an interesting question. I think we've also heard from some folks interest in what would happen if you started oversizing the PV system and looking at some of the trade-offs between PV system sizing and battery system sizing. That's also an area that I think is ripe for some further exploration. So Will, I don't know if you wanted to add to that at all.
No, maybe in interest of time, we try to tackle another question.
Okay. Let's see. The next question is really long, so I'm going to skip that one. Last question here. So the average 15 kilowatt hour battery can support the alternate loads for a day until PV recharges the batteries. So I think that this relates to our limited critical load case, where we found that in all of the locations, at least for the median building, a 15 kilowatt hour battery would be sufficient to provide backup power over a 3-day interruption if you're only providing backup to that limited set of critical loads that excludes heating and cooling. So I think the question asks, or sort of asks basically whether the PV system is large enough to or is able to fully recharge the battery each day. That's not actually the case. I think when we solve for the minimum battery size, typically what's happening is that battery is getting sort of drawn down to its minimum state of charge over the course of the interruption. So the PV system is not fully recharging the battery each day. Is that true, Will, what I just said?
That That is correct. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that 15 kilowatt hour results for the median impact, which there could be a distribution around that number. But the solar is no doubt contributing to the continuation of supply and of load during a backup power event.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we are at time here, actually 1 minute over, so we should wrap up. I will end just by thanking all of you for joining. Hopefully this has been interesting and enlightening. And as Will mentioned, if you're hungry for further details, please do check out the full report. Hopefully I was able to get that URL to you. It seemed like I was not successful in entering that into the chat box initially. But if any of you have questions or aren't able to find the report, please feel free to reach out to Will and I. We're happy to chat further about the study and to point you towards any further information. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Take care. Bye-bye.